Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States and Russia clash Monday at the United Nations Security Council over the crisis in Ukraine. The U.S. accused Russia of preparing to invade Ukraine by amassing over 100,000 troops on its border. But Russia rejected the charge, claiming it was the United States and NATO who are trying to push Russia into war. This is Russia's UN ambassador.
Наши западные коллеги говорят о необходимости деэскалации.
Our Western colleagues are talking about the need for de-escalation. However, first and foremost, they themselves are whipping up tensions and rhetoric and are provoking escalation. The discussions about a threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You are almost calling for this. You want it to happen.
Last week, President Biden placed 8,500 U.S. troops on high alert. The U.S. and NATO allies are also shipping weapons to Ukraine. On the diplomatic front, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken set to speak with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov by phone today. In Washington, U.S. senators are preparing to unveil a bill imposing what Senator Robert Menendez described as the mother of all sanctions, targeting Putin, Russian banks, and other entities. We'll have more on the crisis over Ukraine after headlines. Chinese authorities say they've identified over 200 coronavirus infections among athletes and personnel involved in the Beijing Winter Olympics as China struggles to maintain its zero-COVID strategy. The Winter Olympics opening ceremony will be Friday. Over the weekend, authorities sealed off several residential areas of Beijing where 2 locally transmitted COVID-19 cases were detected. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Monday he tested positive for coronavirus and will work from home. Trudeau, who received a booster shot in early January, reported no symptoms. He said 2 of his 3 school-aged children also tested positive and once again called on Canadians to get vaccinated. Over the weekend, thousands of protesters arrived in Ottawa to oppose vaccine mandates for truck drivers who cross the Canada-U.S. border. Trudeau said some of the protesters displayed Confederate flags, swastikas, and other symbols of hate.
There is always a right to protest peacefully that I and others will defend fully as part of this democracy. There is not a right to incite violence, to perform acts of violence, or to spew hatred.
The number of daily coronavirus infections reported around the United States continues to fall rapidly from mid-January's peak, but remains higher than at any other point in the pandemic. More than 2,500 people are dying of COVID-19 each day, with the official U.S. death toll on pace to pass 900,000 in mid-February. Pfizer is preparing to request emergency use authorization for its vaccine in children aged 6 months to 5 years old. That's according to the Washington Post, which reports the request by Pfizer and its partner BioNTech could come far sooner than expected, and a decision by health regulators could come as early as the end of February. Meanwhile, the Food and Drug Administration's fully authorized Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine for use in U.S. adults. It's the second vaccine to get full FDA approval after Pfizer's mRNA vaccine won full authorization last August. The New York Times reports former President Trump directed his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to ask the Department of Homeland Security if it could legally take control of voting machines in key swing states after Trump lost the 2020 election. The Times cited 3 anonymous sources who said Trump also explored proposals for 2 other government agencies, the Pentagon and the Justice Department, to seize voting machines in an effort to reverse his defeat. The Washington Post reports some of the White House records turned over to the National Archives to congressional investigators had been ripped up by Trump and then taped back together. Trump reportedly had a habit of tearing presidential records into shreds and tossing them on the floor in violation of the Presidential Records Act. CNN reports former Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, quietly testified last week before the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection. Meanwhile, in Georgia, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has asked the FBI to provide security after Trump called on his supporters at a weekend rally to target what he called radical, vicious, racist prosecutors. Last week, a judge approved Willis's request to convene a special grand jury to investigate Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. She She is an African-American woman. In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis Monday lashed out at people who've called on him to condemn a series of Nazi demonstrations over the weekend near Orlando. DeSantis accused Democrats of trying to, quote, smear me as if I had something to do with it. His remarks came after his press secretary, Christina Pushaw, deleted a tweet suggesting the protesters weren't real Nazis and questioned whether they were Democrats in disguise. Meanwhile, police in Chicago have arrested a suspect in a string of apparent hate crimes targeting the Jewish community. The windows of 2 Jewish-owned Chicago businesses were smashed Saturday, while on Sunday a synagogue and Jewish school were vandalized with swastika images and anti-Semitic graffiti. Amnesty International has published a new report accusing Israel of carrying out the crime of apartheid against Palestinians. Amnesty Secretary General Agnes Kalamard told reporters in occupied East Jerusalem today Israel's treatment of Palestinians constitutes a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity.
We are here today to call on the international community to take resolute action against the crime of humanity being perpetrated in order to maintain the system of apartheid.
Israeli officials had demanded Amnesty International not release the report, calling its findings false, biased, and anti-Semitic. In related news, 3 Israeli military officers are being disciplined over their involvement in the January death of a 78-year-old Palestinian-American man in the West Bank. 2 were removed from their positions, and the 3rd will be formally censured. None have been criminally charged. Omar Assad died of a stress-induced heart attack after being bound and gagged and held in a cold construction site by the Israeli soldiers who detained him at a checkpoint while he drove home. In immigration news, the Homeland Security Department confirmed Monday it will expel Venezuelan asylum seekers apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border to Colombia if they previously lived there. The Biden administration had already quietly begun returning Venezuelans to Colombia using a contested Trump-era so-called public health policy called Title 42, which allows U.S. immigration officials to remove asylum seekers without due process during the pandemic. In Mexico, journalist Roberto Toledo was assassinated in the state of Michoacan on Monday, the 4th Mexican media member killed in January alone. Toledo reported for the local news outlet Monitor Michoacan. The outlet's director denounced Toledo's murder in a video posted on social media and said their team had received several death threats.
Today, the threats were ultimately fulfilled. One of our colleagues lost his life at the hands of 3 people who shot him in a mean and cowardly manner. We are not armed. We do not carry weapons. Our only defense is our pen.
To see our segment on the murder of Mexican journalists, you can go to democracynow.org. Burma's military rulers have extended a state of emergency for another 6 months. Monday's announcement came just ahead of the first anniversary of the February 1st coup that deposed democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Burmese military officials have threatened to bring charges of sedition and terrorism against businesses that join a silent strike today to protest the military dictatorship. Meanwhile, there were reports of scattered protests in the capital, Rangoon. UN human rights officials report at least 1,500 people are known to have been killed in the year of protests following the coup. In Brazil, over a dozen people, including 7 children, have died in the state of Sao Paulo since Friday in landslides and flooding triggered by torrential rains. Some 500 families lost their homes. Meanwhile, in Ecuador, at least 11 people died and several others injured in Quito as cars, mud, rocks, and tree trunks were swept away by flooding after a day of record rainfall Monday. The Biden administration said Monday it'll reinstate regulations on emissions of toxic mercury and other pollutants from coal and oil-fired power plants. The move reverses a rollback of environmental rules imposed by President Trump in April 2020. A federal appeals court has ruled an Arizona utility company can be held liable for violations of antitrust laws after it charged its customers higher rates for electricity if they chose to install solar panels on their rooftops. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found evidence that the Salt River Project utility company structured its pricing to unlawfully thwart competition from solar energy systems. Some Salt River Project customers in Phoenix saw their electricity prices rise by more than 60% after they installed solar panels on their homes. In labor news, the Workers United Union says workers at 16 more Starbucks locations around the United States petitioned the National Labor Relations Board for union elections Monday. That brings the number of Starbucks stores where workers are organizing to 54 across 19 states. In December, workers at a Buffalo Starbucks store successfully organized the first union at the coffee giant's 9,000 U.S. locations. In California, a Democratic lawmaker called off a vote Monday on whether to establish a single-payer universal health care system moments before the California State Assembly was scheduled to take up the bill. AB 1400, also known as the California Guaranteed Health Care for All Act, had failed to garner the support of enough Democrats, even though the party has a veto-proof majority in the California legislature. Progressives have vowed to fight to bring the bill to a vote in the next legislative session. The California Democratic Party Progressive Caucus responded, quote, "Health care is a human right, and in the midst of a global pandemic, our Democratic supermajority showed its true colors and its loyalty to the profits of the health care industry over the needs of their constituents," unquote. And in Georgia, a federal judge has rejected plea deals between federal prosecutors and two of the three white men convicted of murdering Ahmaud Arbery. The deals would have allowed Gregory and Travis McMichael to serve the first 30 years of their life sentences in a federal prison instead of a state prison, and to avoid a federal trial scheduled for next week. Ahmaud's father, Marcus Arbery, Monday condemned the plea agreement, saying all three of his son's killers should face federal hate crimes charges.
And we want 100% justice, not no half justice. Because you got to think, if an African-American man would have did a white man like that, they were trying to kill us on the spot.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we'll look at the U.S.-NATO-Ukraine situation as Russia amasses troops on the Ukraine border, and NATO and the United States send weapons to Ukraine. Can a war in Europe be averted? Stay with us.